Okay, so here we are. We're going to finish up our Reconstruction lecture, and I'm going to try to go through it as quickly as possible. So obviously the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are all sort of very important pieces of Republican legislation. 13th abolishes slavery, 14th states that black men are citizens, and the 15th grants voting rights. We talked about this in class, I think, a little bit, but women's rights groups were especially furious about this because many of those white women who were members of the suffragette movement, who wanted to grant women voting rights, believed that they were better educated than. I mean, it is sexist. So there are these overtones of obviously sexism and, a lack of recognition that women should obviously gain rights. But so the groups who oppose the 15th Amendment are not always exactly who you'd expect it to be, although obviously many people, North and South, believe that voting rights are prematurely given to African Americans, particularly men, obviously, since women don't get the right to vote until 1920. So when we spent time talking about Jim Crow South, we spent some time, you guys looked at those articles that dealt with mechanisms that Americans use primarily in the South, although, it is widespread, but primarily in the South, mechanisms that are used to remind African American men that they are less than and that they can be controlled. So these are economic, political, and social strategies that are used to intimidate and to essentially violate African Americans' rights. The most, they run the gamut from, those Louisiana literacy tests that restrict voting rights to obviously the extreme, which is, lynching, which is essentially this vigilante system of justice in which people have are given no trial, and they become these spectator forms of entertainment, which is horrific in and of itself. And that's why, you looked at the Without Sanctuary website, which have those images of, men and women. We also watched in the Jim Crow Many Rivers to Cross PBS video images of lynchings and who is targeted. Although it's pretty across the board. Although lynchings are not always primarily used for African Americans, whites are also included. But you see peak lynchings occur in the 1890s and early 1900s, although they do sporadically occur into the 1950s and 1960s. And what you would see actually civil rights magazines in the 50s and 60s, 40s, 50s, and 60s would, whenever, if there was any lynching, this was not publicized, obviously, sort of in mainstream media, but magazines like Jet Magazine would sort of articulate these things and remind people that they were still happening. So the KKK is pretty powerful, actually for a very brief time, because what you see radical Republicans try to do is make sure that the KKK is not able to restrict the rights and antagonize former slaves in the South. So the problem, however, with this is that it is very sporadically applied, and there's really no bite behind that bark. So it's there, but they really pay lip service to this as time passes, and we'll see why. The KKK, when we looked at Jim Crow, actually is brought back or comes to the forefront, becomes popular again in 1915 when their message of hatred becomes all-inclusive. It doesn't, the KKK doesn't just hate blacks anymore, but anyone who is seen as a threat to white domination, so Jews, Southeastern European immigrants, anyone who does not sort of meet this very clear and strict criteria. So just so you know, the lost cause is similar to the idea of Germany's, this myth that Germany could have won World War I. Hitler perpetuates this, helps lead to the Nazi Party, right? The lost cause is that, if the South had held out, they could have won the war. And it's ways in which people, like Margaret Mitchell mentions this, by the way, that the understanding of the end of the war, the Civil War, she was shocked when she found out that the South actually lost the war, because the way it was depicted, there was no sense that the South was going to lose. So this starts to take hold, and there's two groups who challenged federal enforcement of these laws, and they're called the Bourbons and the Redeemers. And these people are members of the Democratic Party, typically, who are white, pro-business, and really opposed to any kind of Republican legislation, radical or not. The Bourbons, it's a reference to the dynasty in France who were overthrown during the French Revolution, so it's obviously not something that they call themselves. They're really more sort of redeemers. They see themselves as redeemers. That's a much more positive term. So Republicans would call these people Bourbons, right? That's like kind of a slur. Like you want to be called some sort of like tyrannical, autocratic, despotic term. And you can see, in the picture that's in front of you, a family is, at the fireside, and a gun is being pointed through. And in the window, you see, KKK members. There's actually an amazing scene in, not that I'm saying this is a historical film at all, but there's a really great scene in, two scenes actually. One in a movie called Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?, in which the KKK is mocked, clearly. And the other amazing scene is in the movie Django, where Django and his friend, whose name escapes me at the moment, but the other guy, the Christopher White's guy, are going to be attacked by them, and they have this whole conversation about the masks and why they're going to wear them. It's really funny. But again, it's not historically accurate at all. But anyway. Okay, this is going to be a really important piece of legislation. However, it doesn't really have any impact. So you are going to, the next time you see a Civil Rights Act passed is 1965. So the problem is that there's no way to enforce this. And when you looked at black codes, what that winds up translating into are all of these different ways that all of these different methods that people use in the South, but also again in the North, to make sure that whatever gains are made are really negated, okay? So things like literacy tests or poll taxes or grandfather clauses, all of those items are used to restrict the rights that are gained during Reconstruction. And then we get to the abandonment of Reconstruction. We talked about why, and we talked about ultimately, Reconstruction is obviously a laudable effort. I can't imagine anyone would argue it wasn't. I mean, I guess, okay, fine, you could say, we'll talk about why you could say that, but the idea that granting rights, and that's what I see Reconstruction as, like the focus is granting rights to a formerly enslaved people, is obviously laudable and commendable. The way in which it was done is part of the problem. The fact that there is no buy-in from large members or large portions of the American public is part of the problem, or Congress for that matter. So the North becomes, the farther the Civil War gets, people become less and less concerned. So you have the corruption that is endemic in the country. It's not just part of the South. There's corruption everywhere. And you have these economic issues that we talked about in class already. The Panic of 1873 is one that consumes people's thoughts. You have westward expansion, Indian Wars, the railroads, right? I mean, people are not thinking anymore about how are we going to fix the South. They've moved on. And that's the problem. Like people had to, stick it out and see it through. And you see this all the time. This isn't just like, congressional issues. This is like life. If you don't have follow through, if you're not committed to what you're doing, it's not going to turn out well. Like if I half plan a lesson, the first half of it could be awesome, but if I don't see follow through, it's going to suck. Like overall, it's not going to work. And that's kind of Reconstruction. Like it's a really great lesson. There's so many good guiding questions, and it's really provocative. And initially, the kids are really excited, but then I didn't really think it through, or I had a really kind of lackluster, assessment. And then, if the teacher's not into it and then the kids aren't into it, then it's just not going to work. So my not very complicated analogy is Northerners become concerned with their own very real, very immediate problems, which are primarily economic. So this mentions westward expansion and Indian Wars. Monetary issues are going to become increasingly issue with greenbacks, and that means dollars, by the way, and the circulation of dollars. Specie is hard current, like gold, something that's tied to gold or gold actually itself, gold and silver coinage. And we're going to see this becoming an increasing issue in the 1880s, 1890s. But you also see the industrialization, immigrants arriving becomes concerning to Northerners in a way that Reconstruction or Reconstruction policies are not. Okay, so 1872. Grant is not super popular. Horace Greeley runs, and he is not very popular. Horace Greeley is an editor of a newspaper, and he acts as a viable alternative to Grant, but he's he's not seen as anyone that really, they respect him. And you can see here, the electoral vote, I mean, he's not pulling too much here. Oh, let's look how it's spotty. I mean, I wonder, by the way, no returns are unsettled, I think has to do with like who's voting and who's able to vote. 1876 is the major election that we're going to be looking at. Obviously, this is the corrupt bargain, like the part two, right? The other corrupt bargain that you learned about last year was between Jackson and John Quincy Adams, right? John Quincy Adams steals the election from Jackson, gives Henry Clay that Secretary of State position, which Andrew Jackson totally believes, but is probably not true. It seems like something John Quincy Adams would not do. However, it's pretty clear that back deals are made here, and they're actually not back deals. This is very widely publicized. So Tilden fully wins the election, but and people like papers are like this is clear that he's going to win. And what winds up happening is the recognition that if Hayes gets certain states, I think it's like Louisiana and like South Carolina or something, that they can control the government. And so what happens is, sorry, I'm going to go back here for a second, that they form this committee and they have independent people collect the returns, and people vote along party lines and grant, haha, that's so funny, grant Hayes the election. And with that comes the effective end of Reconstruction, because with this corrupt bargain, troops are pulled out. So if you go back actually, and you kind of go like right here, underneath here, do you see where I have this little note here for you? Federal troops are withdrawn from the South. Federal money to build the railroad from Texas to the West Coast, they give them money, and the conservative Southerner is put in Hayes's cabinet. So you have essentially the railroad is becoming more concerning, right? And you have federal troops removed, and and you have a voice of a conservative Southerner in the cabinet, which violates sort of everything that the radical Republicans are fighting for. And this is going to lead to Jim Crow laws that we looked at in some significant depth, and when you talked about Plessy versus Ferguson. And what did I want to talk about? With my period one kid, I was like all excited. I was like, I'll talk. Oh, I know, the visions for African Americans, and I'll do that right now. So Plessy versus Ferguson is the basis for which people lived their lives pretty much from the year 1896 to 1954, when it's overturned in the Brown versus Board of Education case. Although I would argue that, it's not, by the way, when people are like, oh, hey, that's illegal. Obviously, as you know, and we'll be looking at in more detail, but I think you guys already know this is like part of like sort of American, like the American, what's the word I'm looking for? Like collective memory. Everyone knows that segregation, once it's declared unconstitutional, does not end immediately. Everyone has those images in their heads of Little Rock and children walking to school and Boston busing, and you looked at that. I mean, it's, federal government is no longer promoting segregation or allowing it to be legal, but it certainly continues, if not illegally, then, socially and politically. But that's why you see people like Booker T. Washington and Du Bois and Garvey looking to navigate this world, literally and figuratively. How do we get from place to place? That green book, where can African Americans go? How can they get there without fear of bodily harm or persecution? And so people, and this is what I wanted you guys to do in class and think about, Washington, Garvey, and Du Bois all have very particular visions, right? They all think that how their ideas are going to solve the problems. And they solve them in very different ways, and they solve them in different ways because they are different kinds of people. And their background, I think, really influences a lot of what they perceive the problem to be and how they're going to solve it, right? My experience as, a white woman in her early 30s is going to be very different than, say, anyone else. Like, that's my particular sort of opinion, right? And the same is true for you. When students say, we don't feel that we're enfranchised, or literally, but we don't feel that the administration hears us. Well, that's coming from a very particular perspective, and that's your perspective. So people like, maybe I'll do this. What I'll insert a new slide and I'll type some of this stuff in as I'm talking about it. So you have people like Garvey, right? And then you have Washington, then you have Du Bois, and they have very different visions. And what you're doing in class today, what you've done in class today, is sort of identify what these visions are. And what we talked about in class, and I want to reinforce this idea, okay, is thinking about, oh my God, where's my thing? Did I just, hold on. Oh, okay, I think I'm still talking. Oh man, I just got freaked out that this whole thing did not work. Okay, I think it did. Okay, so what you want to think about is like the positives, or like what works with Garvey's argument, what doesn't work, and would this work in a 21st century way or in a 19th century way or early 20th century way? So that's what you want to think about, not just like what are their visions, but think about where they're coming from and how their visions work. Okay, so hopefully this really helps you review and read your AMSCO and look at those readings that we assigned you, and you'll be good to go.